The storm hit the city like it had a personal grudge. Rain came down in sheets, hammering the glass walls of Barrett Vance's penthouse 40 floors above downtown. He stood by the window with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched in an hour, watching lightning split the sky over buildings he owned but rarely thought about. Barrett wasn't a man who startled easily. Years of running one of the most disciplined organizations in the city had trained that reaction out of him. So when a knock came from the fire escape door, not the front entrance, not the private elevator, but the fire escape, 40 floors up, he set his glass down slow and quiet, the way he did everything. Nobody used that door. Nobody could use that door. It was wired into a security grid that cost more than most people's houses, monitored around the clock by men who didn't miss things. And yet, there it was. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more. He crossed the room without turning on the lights, one hand slipping instinctively to the inside of his jacket before he caught himself. Whoever was out there in that storm wasn't announcing an attack. An attack didn't knock. When he opened the door, the wind shoved a spray of rain into his face, and for a second all he saw was a shape huddled against the railing, soaked through, shivering, arms wrapped around a black duffel bag like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Please," she said, teeth chattering so hard the word barely held together. "I just need somewhere dry, just for tonight." She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair plastered flat against her face and a coat 2 sizes too big that had stopped doing its job hours ago. She was heavier than the women who usually found their way into rooms like his. Not that Barrett noticed things like that. Not really. Except that right now, what he noticed was how her whole body shook, how her lips had gone the color of the storm clouds behind her. "How did you get up here?" he asked. Not unkind, just direct. "I don't know," she admitted. "There was a maintenance ladder, a door that wasn't locked. I wasn't trying to break in, I swear, I saw the light on and I couldn't feel my hands anymore." Barrett looked past her, out at the black drop below the railing, 40 stories of empty air between this platform and the street. Whatever path she'd taken to get here, it wasn't one that should have existed. His security team was going to have a very long conversation with him in the morning. But that was a problem for tomorrow. "Get inside," he said, stepping back from the door. She hesitated, just for a second, like she couldn't quite believe the invitation was real. And then she moved past him into the penthouse, dripping onto floors that cost more per square foot than her old apartment's entire rent. Barrett shut the door behind her and threw the bolt, sealing out the storm. In the light, she looked worse. Bruised knees showing through torn jeans, a split on her lip that had scabbed over days ago. And underneath the exhaustion, something sharper, a wariness in her eyes that told him she was used to rooms like this one going wrong. "I'm Ridley," she said before he could ask. "Ridley Park. I know this looks... I'm not here to rob you or anything. I didn't even know whose place this was." "Barrett," he said simply. He didn't offer a last name. Most people in the city didn't need one. He pulled a blanket from the closet by the door and held it out. She took it like it might disappear if she moved too fast, wrapping it around her shoulders with hands that hadn't stopped trembling. Barrett watched her sink onto the edge of his couch, still clutching that duffel bag like it was bolted to her arms. "You're not going to ask me to leave?" she said quietly. "Not tonight." He moved toward the kitchen, pulling a pot from the cabinet without really thinking about it. "There's soup. Sit. Warm up." She didn't argue. Whatever fight she'd had left in her, the storm and the climb, and however many nights before this one had used it all up. Barrett worked in silence, listening to the rain lash the windows, and every few seconds his eyes drifted back to that duffel bag, sitting in her lap like a shield. He'd built his life on noticing things other people missed. The flinch before a lie, the weight of a bag that carried more than clothes, the particular way someone held onto an object like it was the only proof they had that their life meant something. Ridley Park held that bag the way people held onto things they were terrified of losing. He didn't ask about it. Not yet. There would be time. When the soup was ready, he set a bowl in front of her and watched some of the color creep back into her face as she ate. Outside, the storm showed no signs of slowing. Inside, Barrett Vance sat across from a stranger who had somehow bypassed every layer of security he'd built around his life and felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he cared to admit. Curiosity. Not suspicion, not yet. Just the quiet, persistent pull of a mystery he hadn't asked for and couldn't quite look away from. He had no idea yet that the bag in her lap held the key to a war he thought he'd already won. Morning came grey and quiet, the storm reduced to a steady drizzle against the windows. Barrett had barely slept. Old habits, the kind that came from running an organization where a single unguarded night could cost you everything, kept him up long after Ridley had drifted off on the couch, the duffel bag still tucked against her side like a second pillow. He found her awake when he came out of the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee, sitting up with the blanket pooled around her waist, looking smaller in daylight than she had in the storm. The bruises on her knees looked worse now, purple-green under the grey light. "You didn't have to let me stay," she said, taking the cup he offered. "Most people wouldn't have." "Most people aren't me." He sat in the chair across from her, unhurried. "How long were you out there? Before last night, I mean." She looked down at her coffee like the answer was written somewhere in the steam. "A few months. It's complicated. I've got time." She didn't take the invitation to explain further, and Barrett didn't push. Pushing rarely got him anywhere useful. Instead, he let his eyes drift, the way he always did, cataloguing details without meaning to. The frayed strap of her duffel bag, the careful way she'd set it down within arm's reach even while sleeping. The small brass tag clipped to the zipper pull. It caught the light for just a second, a flash of metal stamped with a design he knew better than his own signature. Barrett's hands stilled around his cup. "Where did you get that bag?" he asked, and something in his voice must have shifted because Ridley looked up sharply. "What?" "The bag," he nodded toward it. "Where did it come from?" She glanced down at it, defensive now, pulling it half an inch closer. "I found it. There's an old utility room under the Ashford Street subway station. Most people don't know it's there, but it's dry, and it's got a door that locks from the inside. I've been sleeping there when I could get in. The bag was already there, shoved behind some pipes. I figured whoever left it wasn't coming back for it." "May I look at it?" She hesitated. Barrett understood the hesitation. A bag was armor when you had nothing else, and asking to look inside someone's only possession was asking for more trust than a single night of soup and shelter had earned. But after a moment, she loosened her grip and pushed it toward him across the coffee table. Barrett turned the tag over in his fingers, a brass emblem, small and unassuming to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, a stylized wolf's head circled by a broken chain. He'd seen that mark exactly twice in his life. Once carved into the door of a warehouse his father had burned to the ground before Barrett was old enough to understand why. And once in a photograph in a file he kept locked in a drawer he hadn't opened in years. The Kestrel Crew. The rogue faction that had splintered off from an alliance his family once trusted completely, right before they turned around and gutted that alliance from the inside, stealing routes, burning down warehouses, and disappearing into the city's underbelly with everything they'd taken. Barrett had been 19 when it happened, old enough to remember his father's face when the news came in, old enough to remember what came after. He hadn't seen that emblem in 11 years. He'd started to believe he never would again. "You don't recognize this," he said quietly. It wasn't quite a question. "Should I?" Ridley watched him carefully now, some of the exhaustion clearing from her face, replaced by something sharper. She was smart. He could see her working it out in real time, connecting his sudden stillness to the tag in his hand. "You know something about this? About the bag?" Barrett weighed his options the way he weighed everything, quickly, thoroughly, without letting it show on his face. He could tell her nothing. Send her on her way with cash and a warm coat and let the whole thing disappear back into the city where he'd found it. That would be the careful choice. The choice a man who valued control above everything would make. But 11 years was a long time to wonder about a debt that never got paid. "This mark belonged to a group that hurt my family a long time ago," he said finally. "Before you were sleeping in that subway room. Before you were probably old enough to remember much of anything about this city at all." Ridley's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't flinch away from him the way most people would have, hearing something like that from a man like him. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what it was. I just needed somewhere dry to keep my things." "I believe you." And he did. There was nothing rehearsed in the way she'd told him about the utility room, nothing calculated in the surprise on her face now. She was exactly what she appeared to be. Someone who'd stumbled into shelter and found more than she bargained for. But if this bag was left behind in a place people like that used to hide, it means they were there. Recently, maybe. Which means that room isn't as forgotten as you think it is. Ridley's hand went instinctively to the bag, pulling it back into her lap, and for the first time since he'd opened that fire escape door, Barrett saw real fear cross her face. Not the fear of a stranger's penthouse, but something older, something that made her glance toward the windows, like the storm outside might be hiding more than rain. "If they left it there," she said slowly, "does that mean they're going to come looking for it?" Barrett didn't answer right away. He was already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way he always did when the ground shifted beneath him, recalculating, reassessing, turning the pieces over to see what shape they made. "I think," he said finally, "we should find out before they find you first." The building's security hub sat 3 floors below the penthouse, a windowless room lined with monitors that fed from every camera Barrett owned across the property. Lobby, garage, rooftop, and a dozen angles of the surrounding streets that most tenants didn't know existed. Barrett rarely came down here himself. He had people for that. But this morning he wanted his own eyes on the footage, not a summary relayed second-hand. Ridley followed him down, still wrapped in a borrowed sweater 2 sizes too big, the duffel bag left upstairs at his insistence. "It's safer with me watching it than dragging it through a security room full of cameras," he'd told her, and she hadn't argued, though he could tell it cost her something to leave it behind. Marcus, the head of building security, looked up when they walked in, his eyebrows lifting slightly at the sight of a stranger trailing behind his boss. He didn't ask questions. That was part of why Barrett trusted him. "Pull up everything from last night," Barrett said, starting an hour before the fire escape alarm should have tripped and didn't. Marcus's fingers moved fast over the keyboard, and a wall of monitors flickered through timestamps, rewinding the previous evening in fast, jerky segments. Barrett watched in silence, arms crossed, while Ridley hovered near the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed to stand any closer. "There," Marcus said, freezing a frame. The footage showed the alley behind the building, rain distorting the image into streaks of grey and orange streetlight. A figure moved along the far wall, hood up, moving with the particular caution of someone who knew exactly where the cameras were and exactly how to stay out of their direct line. He reached the base of the maintenance ladder Ridley had climbed and paused there for almost a full minute, looking up. "That's him," Ridley said suddenly, stepping closer to the monitor. Her voice had gone tight. "That's the man from the subway station. The one who chased me out of the utility room 3 nights ago." Barrett studied the frozen image. The man's face was mostly hidden, but something about his posture, the deliberate stillness, the way he scanned the building before moving on, read as trained rather than desperate. Not a random opportunist, someone who knew how to case a building. "Keep going," Barrett said. Marcus advanced the footage. The man never went up the ladder himself. Instead, he retreated to the mouth of the alley and disappeared from frame, only to reappear 4 minutes later in a different camera angle, climbing into a dark sedan idling at the curb across the boulevard, engine running the whole time. "He's still there," Marcus said, switching to a live feed. "Or someone is. Same car's been parked in that spot since 6 this morning." The current feed showed the same tinted sedan, rain-streaked and unremarkable, positioned with a clear sightline to the building's main entrance and the fire escape both. Whoever was inside wasn't in a hurry. They were waiting. Ridley's arms wrapped around herself, and for a moment she looked exactly like she had on the fire escape the night before, small, cold, cornered. "He followed me," she said quietly. "He followed me all the way here." "He didn't follow you," Barrett said, and something in his tone made her look at him. "He followed the bag. You said yourself you found it hidden behind pipes in a room he clearly still uses. That tag isn't just decoration. It's how the Kestrel Crew tracks its own property. If that bag has any kind of transponder woven into the lining, they've known exactly where it's been since the moment you picked it up." Ridley's face went pale. "So this whole time, sleeping there, walking around the city with it, they knew?" "Maybe not from the start, but once you didn't come back to that utility room, and the bag didn't either, someone would have gone looking. And once they traced it here, to this building, to me..." Barrett stopped himself, jaw tightening. "They'll know exactly who has it now, and they'll know exactly what that means." "Which is what?" Barrett turned back to the monitor, watching the rain slide down the sedan's windshield, watching for any flicker of movement inside that would tell him whether the driver was alone. "It means for 11 years I've had nothing. No location, no lead, nothing to go on except a name and a mark I hadn't seen since I was little, watching my father's world fall apart. And now a woman falls out of a storm with the one thing that could lead me straight back to them." He didn't say the rest out loud, that some part of him, the part that had spent over a decade turning that unfinished business over and over in the dark, felt something close to relief at the sight of that sedan. Not because he wanted more danger in his life, because he finally had a thread to pull. "I didn't ask for any of this," Ridley said, and there was an edge in her voice now, somewhere between fear and frustration. "I just wanted somewhere dry to sleep." "I know." Barrett looked at her properly then, softening the delivery even if the situation itself gave him no room to soften. "And I'm not going to pretend this isn't dangerous, or that I don't understand why you're scared. But that man down there isn't going to stop watching this building because you wish he would. The safest thing for you now isn't distance from me, it's proximity." Marcus glanced between them, saying nothing, though his hand had already drifted toward the phone on his desk, calling in extra coverage without needing to be told. Ridley looked back at the frozen image of the man who'd chased her from the only shelter she'd had, then at the live feed of the car, still waiting patiently across the boulevard, and finally at Barrett, who was watching her with the quiet, unreadable calculation of a man already 3 moves ahead. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steadier than her hands. "Tell me what happens next." Barrett didn't answer her question right away. He turned instead to Marcus, already thinking through logistics the way he'd been trained to since he was young. Not the plan he wanted, but the plan that worked. "Pull the Range Rover from the main garage and leave it running by the front doors," he said, loud about it. "Let them see it." Marcus nodded and reached for his radio without asking why. Ridley, though, looked between the two of them with the wary confusion of someone still catching up to a language she didn't speak yet. "You just told me the safest thing was staying close to you," she said. "Now you're sending a car out the front, right past the people watching it." "I'm sending a decoy out the front." Barrett was already moving toward the door that led down to the building's sub-basement, and she fell into step beside him because there wasn't much else to do. "The car in the boulevard is watching the entrance and the fire escape. It's not watching a maintenance tunnel built before either of us was born." The sub-basement smelled like concrete and old rain, lit by a string of bare bulbs that buzzed faintly overhead. Barrett led her past rows of storage cages and a bank of humming generators to a plain steel door that looked, to Ridley's eyes, like it hadn't been opened in years. It hadn't, not by anyone who wasn't supposed to know it existed. Behind it sat a black, armored sedan, windows tinted dark enough to swallow light, parked in a garage bay that connected to a service road 2 blocks over. No markings, no plates that would trace back to Barrett's name on any public record. "Get in," he said, already pulling the driver's door open. "And put the bag on the floor, not your lap. If we hit anything sharp, I don't want it thrown around the cabin." She did as he said, sliding into the passenger seat with the duffel bag wedged between her feet, watching him settle behind the wheel with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. The engine turned over low and smooth, nothing like the growl of the Range Rover pulling away from the front entrance 3 floors above them, a sound loud enough, Barrett hoped, to hold the sedan's attention for the few critical minutes he needed. They pulled out into a service alley slicked with rain, fog rolling low along the pavement, swallowing streetlights into soft orange smudges. Barrett drove without headlights for the first stretch, navigating from memory through a part of the city Ridley had never seen. Narrow industrial roads wedged between warehouses, underpasses that doubled back on themselves. A route that made no logical sense unless the point was exactly that. "You've done this before," she said, watching the mirrors the way he kept watching them. "Not recently, but you don't forget how." He took a hard left down a road with no name posted, tires hissing against wet asphalt. "My father used to say the city has two maps, the one everyone drives on and the one that actually gets you somewhere when it matters." For a while, nothing followed. Ridley let herself believe, just slightly, that they'd slipped away clean. Then Barrett's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror and stayed there a beat too long. "We've got company." She twisted in her seat. Behind them, maybe 4 car lengths back, a pair of headlights had turned onto the same nameless road. Too smooth a turn to be coincidence. Too consistent a distance to be anything but deliberate. "Same car from the boulevard?" "Can't be certain. Doesn't matter." Barrett's hands tightened slightly on the wheel, though his voice stayed level, almost bored, like this was a mild inconvenience rather than a threat trailing them through the fog. "Hold on to something." He cut the wheel hard right into a gap between 2 warehouse buildings that didn't look wide enough for the car, scraping past a dumpster with inches to spare, and Ridley grabbed the door handle as the world tilted and straightened. The headlights behind them wavered, slowed, searched for the turn they'd missed. Barrett didn't celebrate. He kept moving, weaving through a maze of loading docks and freight bays, cutting his lights again at a blind corner, letting the car coast into a shadowed gap between 2 shipping containers until the engine noise died to almost nothing. They sat there in silence, both of them watching the mouth of the alley, waiting. The trailing headlights swept past 30 seconds later, slow and uncertain, then kept going, swallowed by the fog further down the road, chasing a version of the route that no longer matched where they actually were. Ridley let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was too close. That was exactly close enough. Barrett eased the car back onto the road once the taillights had fully disappeared, taking a longer, quieter path that curved away from the industrial district entirely. If it had been too close, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. She studied him in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, the calm set of his jaw, the total absence of panic in a man who just outmaneuvered someone hunting them through fog and back roads like it was routine. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere they don't know to look. Not yet, anyway." Barrett merged onto an empty highway ramp, the city lights shrinking in the mirrors behind them, replaced by darkness and the first hint of open countryside. "It's a 2-hour drive. You should sleep if you can." Ridley didn't think she'd be able to, but somewhere past the first hour, lulled by the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of a man who drove like nothing in the world could rattle him, her eyes finally closed, the duffel bag still resting safely between her feet, carrying secrets neither of them had fully uncovered yet. Ridley woke to the sound of gravel crunching under tires, the highway long behind them, replaced by a private road that wound through dark trees for what felt like miles. When she finally opened her eyes fully, the manor rose up out of the mist ahead of them like something out of a story she'd never expected to find herself inside of. Stone walls, tall windows glowing faintly gold, a wrought iron gate closing itself behind the car with a heavy, final sound. "This is yours?" she asked, voice still thick with sleep. "My grandfather's, originally." Barrett pulled the car into a covered drive beside the main entrance and cut the engine. "Nobody outside my closest circle knows this address, not even most of my own people." The inside was worse, or better, depending on how she wanted to look at it. High ceilings, a curved staircase, furniture that looked like it cost more than every apartment she'd ever lived in combined. A housekeeper appeared briefly to take their coats and disappeared again just as quietly, leaving them alone in an entryway that echoed every footstep. Ridley stood very still in the middle of it, the duffel bag clutched against her chest again, out of place in a way that had nothing to do with her wet clothes or her exhaustion. She was aware, suddenly and completely, of every rough edge on her, the split lip, the bruised knees, the sweater that wasn't hers, the months of sleeping in a subway utility room that had led, impossibly, to standing in a room like this. "I should go," she said abruptly. Barrett turned back from the staircase, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "Go where?" "I don't know, anywhere. This is—" She gestured vaguely at the vaulted ceiling, the paintings on the walls, the sheer scale of a life she had no business being folded into. "This isn't a place for someone like me. I'll bring trouble to your door and then I'll be a burden on top of it. You don't owe me a mansion. You already gave me soup and a blanket. That was more than enough." "Sit down, Ridley." It wasn't a command exactly, but it wasn't a suggestion either. She hesitated, then lowered herself onto the arm of a nearby chair, still holding the bag like a shield. Barrett crossed the room and sat across from her, elbows on his knees, meeting her eyes directly instead of looking down at her from the doorway, the way the whole house seemed built to make people do. "You're not a burden. You're not trouble I didn't already have. That car chasing us through the fog wasn't chasing you specifically. It was chasing 11 years of unfinished business that happened to find its way back to me through you. If anything, I dragged you into this." "You didn't drag me into anything. I climbed onto your fire escape. And I could have called the police the moment I opened that door, instead of handing you a blanket." He held her gaze steadily. "I didn't. So let's not pretend either of us is only doing the other a favor here." Ridley looked down at the bag in her lap, turning the brass tag over between her fingers the way she'd been doing without noticing since the drive. "I've been on my own a long time," she said quietly. "People don't usually mean it when they say stay. They mean it until it's inconvenient." "I'm not most people." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." A faint, almost reluctant smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, the first she'd seen from him since the fire escape. "You're a guest in this house, Ridley. Not a liability, not a project, not someone I'm keeping around out of pity. If that changes, I'll tell you plainly. I don't have much patience for pretending." Something in her shoulders loosened, just slightly, the way a person's does when they've been braced for impact and the impact doesn't come. She didn't fully believe him yet. Trust like that didn't rebuild in a single conversation. But it was enough, for now, to stop looking for the nearest exit. "Fine," she said, "but I'm not going to just sit around your mansion doing nothing while you figure out how to fight your family's old enemies." Barrett studied her for a moment, something like approval flickering across his face. "Good, because I wasn't planning on letting you." He stood, offering her a hand up that she took after only a brief pause. "This estate has a perimeter system, but it's outdated, older than the tunnels I drove us through tonight. If the Kestrel Crew has any resources left, they'll eventually find this place too. I'd rather not wait until that happens to fix it." "You want my help with security? I slept in a subway station 3 days ago." "You bypassed 40 floors of the tightest perimeter system in the city without setting off a single alarm," Barrett said flatly. "I'd say you understand gaps in security better than half the men I pay to prevent them." That surprised a short laugh out of her, the first real sound of it since the storm, and Barrett found himself watching the shift in her face like it mattered more than it should have. They spent the rest of the evening walking the estate's edges together, Ridley pointing out blind spots in the tree line and gaps where a fence met uneven ground, Barrett making notes on his phone and calling in adjustments to a team that would arrive by morning. It wasn't friendship yet, not exactly, but by the time they finally climbed the wide staircase to separate rooms well past midnight, something steadier than gratitude had settled between them. The quiet, unspoken respect of two people who had each decided, without saying so out loud, that they were in this together now. 3 days passed in a rhythm that surprised them both. Mornings spent walking the estate's perimeter with the new security team, afternoons quiet, evenings settling into an ease neither of them had expected from two strangers thrown together by a storm. Ridley had stopped flinching every time a floorboard creaked. Barrett had stopped watching her like she might vanish the moment his back was turned. It was on the 7th evening, rain tapping softly against the library windows, that Ridley finally unzipped the duffel bag all the way and tipped its contents onto the low table between them. Clothes, worn thin from use, a cracked phone that no longer turned on, and beneath all of it, wrapped in a plastic bag gone cloudy with age, a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages swollen and warped from water damage. "I found this the same night I found the brass tag," she said, peeling back the plastic carefully. "I didn't think much of it before. Just old handwriting, numbers that didn't mean anything to me." Barrett leaned forward, the firelight catching the sharp focus in his eyes as he took the ledger from her hands like it might crumble at the wrong touch. The ink had bled in places, entire lines dissolved into illegible smears, but enough remained, columns of dates, initials, figures that meant nothing to an untrained eye, and everything to a man who'd grown up reading his father's books over his shoulder. "This is theirs," he said quietly. "Kestrel Crew shorthand. My father used to intercept pages like this back when the Alliance still held. I haven't seen this exact hand in over a decade." They spent the next several hours hunched over the low table by the fire, the ledger open between them, Barrett translating the coded shorthand, while Ridley read each entry aloud, both of them slowly piecing together a map neither of them had asked to find. Most of it meant little to Ridley, names she didn't recognize, transactions in numbers too large to picture. But one section, near the back where the water damage had spared the most, stopped her cold. "These," she said, tapping a column of numbers repeated 3 times across different pages. "These aren't dates, or account codes. Look at the format." Barrett studied where she pointed. "What am I looking at?" "Grid coordinates. I used to help my uncle with delivery routes before everything happened. He used a shorthand exactly like this for loading docks along the river, because half the terminal buildings down there don't have real addresses, just slip numbers and pier codes." She traced the string of digits with her finger. "This isn't a bank code. It's a location." Barrett went very still. He pulled his laptop from the side table, cross-referencing the coordinates against a satellite map of the city's old industrial waterfront, and watched as the pin dropped precisely onto a cluster of buildings his own legal team had walked past a dozen times over the years without ever flagging as significant. An abandoned shipping terminal, half collapsed and condemned, the kind of place nobody thought twice about because it looked like it had nothing left worth hiding. "My people had this address in a file 8 years ago," he said slowly. "Flagged as low priority. Structurally unsound, no activity reported, nothing worth the resources to investigate further." He looked up at her, something sharpening behind his eyes. They missed it because they were looking for something obvious, a working headquarters, not a ruin. "Maybe that's the point," Ridley said. "Nobody looks twice at a building that already looks abandoned." Barrett sat back, running a hand along his jaw, turning the pieces over the way he always did, testing them for weaknesses, for the places where the story might fall apart under pressure. 11 years of nothing, he said, mostly to himself. 11 years of watching every real estate transaction in this city, every shell company, every rumor that came through informants who owed me favors. And it was sitting in a ledger inside a bag left behind in a subway tunnel, waiting for someone who had no idea what she was carrying. I didn't do anything special. I just knew what delivery codes looked like. You did more than that. He met her eyes directly, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the calm, controlled calculation she'd grown used to, but something closer to genuine astonishment. My legal team has 3 lawyers and a former intelligence analyst working full-time on cases like this. None of them cracked this in 8 years. You did it in 1 evening. Ridley shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of a compliment she didn't quite know how to hold. It's not that impressive. I just recognized the pattern. That's exactly what makes it impressive. Barrett closed the laptop slowly, the pin on the map still burned into his mind. Recognizing what everyone else overlooks, that's rarer than people think. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady patter against the windows, the fire burning low in the hearth, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The ledger sat open between them, water-stained and fragile, holding 11 years of silence that had just cracked wide open because a woman with nowhere else to sleep had picked the wrong bag off the ground in a forgotten subway room. So what happens now? Ridley finally asked. Barrett's jaw set with quiet resolve, the fire reflecting in his eyes like something had been reignited that had gone cold a long time ago. "Now," he said, "we go take a look at that terminal ourselves. Carefully, from a distance first." He glanced at her, something almost like warmth cutting through the determination. "You've done more for this family in 1 week than most people manage in a lifetime. I'm not about to let you sit this next part out." They left the manor 2 nights later, once Barrett's security team had confirmed the perimeter was solid enough to hold without him standing over it. The drive back into the city felt different this time, not the desperate flight through fog they'd made a week earlier, but something calmer, more deliberate. 2 people moving with a plan instead of running from the lack of one. The riverfront district hadn't changed much in the years since Barrett had last walked its edges. Warehouses stood shoulder to shoulder along the water, half of them condemned, their windows boarded or shattered, the whole stretch smelling of rust and diesel and the particular damp that clung to buildings nobody bothered maintaining anymore. Barrett parked the unmarked car 3 blocks back, in the shadow of a scrapyard fence, and the 2 of them continued on foot. "You said there was a lookout tower," Ridley said, keeping her voice low even though the streets around them were empty. "There." Barrett nodded toward a rusted structure rising above the tree line along the water's edge, a relic from when the terminal had been a working port and someone needed eyes on incoming ships. "Half the boards are rotted through, but the top platform should hold. It's got a clean line of sight to the terminal building without putting us anywhere near their perimeter." The climb up wasn't easy. Ridley's hands found splinters twice before she learned where to grip, and Barrett went ahead of her at each landing to test the boards before letting her follow. By the time they reached the top, both of them were breathing hard, the cold river wind cutting through their jackets, but the view made the climb worth it. Barrett handed her a pair of high-powered binoculars and settled in beside her against the railing, both of them low enough that their silhouettes wouldn't break the skyline. "Tell me what you see," he said. Ridley raised the binoculars, adjusting the focus with practiced ease that surprised him slightly, another small piece of a life he didn't fully know yet. Below, the terminal building looked exactly as abandoned as his files had described. Broken windows, a collapsed section of roof near the northern end. But as she watched, patterns began to emerge that a passing glance would have missed entirely. "There," she said. "Northeast corner, ground level. That door's been reinforced, new hinges, and it doesn't sag the way every other door on that building does." She shifted her focus slightly. "And there's a man near the loading dock. He's been standing in the exact same spot for 6 minutes. Nobody stands still that long unless they're posted there on purpose." Barrett took the binoculars from her and confirmed it himself, watching the guard shift his weight, glance at his watch, then settle back into stillness. Trained. Bored, but disciplined. Not a random squatter using an empty building for shelter. "How many have you counted?" 3 so far. 1 at the loading dock, 1 who did a slow walk along the south fence line about 10 minutes ago and hasn't come back into view, and I think there's a 4th up on the roof near that collapsed section. I saw movement, but I couldn't get a clean look." They stayed on the platform for over an hour, trading the binoculars back and forth, Ridley cataloguing details with an attentiveness that came, Barrett realized, from years of learning to read a room before it turned dangerous. A skill sharpened by circumstances he still didn't fully understand, but one he was grateful for now. She noted the guard rotation, roughly every 40 minutes based on 2 shift changes they witnessed. She noticed a delivery van that arrived and left through a side gate that wasn't visible from the main road. Its driver waved through without any visible checkpoint. "That's their supply route," Barrett murmured, watching the van disappear down a side street. "Whatever's left of this operation, they're still running something through that gate." "Small," Ridley said. "Whatever it is, it's not big. That van's barely large enough for pallets, not shipping containers. If this were still a full operation, you'd see more traffic than this." Barrett lowered the binoculars, turning the pieces over in his mind the way he did with everything, testing weight, testing weakness. "You think they're running on fumes?" "I think," Ridley said carefully, "that a group hiding in a building this abandoned, guarding it this quietly, running supplies through a back gate instead of a proper dock, That's not a syndicate at full strength. That's people trying not to be found because they don't have the resources to survive being found. It matched what Barrett had begun to suspect from the ledger. Entries that thinned out over the past 2 years, numbers that shrank instead of grew, the unmistakable signature of an organization slowly starving rather than expanding. The Kestrel Crew that had once been strong enough to gut his family's alliance had become something smaller, more desperate, hiding in the bones of a building nobody else wanted. Desperate men were dangerous in different ways than powerful ones. Barrett knew that better than most. "We're not moving on this building directly," he said finally, lowering the binoculars for good as the light began to fade. "Not yet. If they're this thin on resources, the smarter play isn't force. It's cutting off whatever's keeping them alive in the first place." "The accounts from the ledger." "The accounts from the ledger." Barrett looked at her, the last of the daylight catching the determination in his face. "Guard schedules and gate details are useful, but they're the last resort. If I can freeze what's funding that supply van before it ever needs to become a fight, nobody has to get hurt to end this." Ridley studied him for a long moment, something like respect settling into her expression. "You could have come down here with a dozen armed men and torn that building apart tonight. You had the numbers advantage." "I could have." Barrett started back toward the ladder, offering her a hand for the descent. "But burning something down rarely ends the story the way you want it to. My father taught me that the hard way. I'd rather starve this out quietly than give them a reason to fight back loudly." Barrett's private office occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, a world away from both the penthouse, where this had all started, and the rotted lookout tower where they'd spent the previous evening. Ridley felt the difference the moment they stepped off the elevator: polished marble, hushed voices, a receptionist who greeted Barrett by name without needing to check a screen first. "This is the legitimate side of things," Barrett said, leading her past a wall of glass offices toward a conference room at the far end of the floor. "Real estate holdings, investment accounts, the parts of my family's business that show up on public filings. It's not as interesting as what you've seen so far, but it's where this fight actually gets won." Inside the conference room, 3 people were already waiting. A sharp-eyed woman introduced as Naomi, head of Barrett's financial division, and 2 analysts who barely looked up from their laptops when Barrett and Ridley walked in. The ledger sat in the center of the table, carefully preserved now in a protective sleeve, its water-damaged pages photographed and enlarged on the screen behind them. "We've cross-referenced the account numbers you sent over," Naomi said, pulling up a spreadsheet dense with figures. "Most of them route through 3 shell companies registered offshore, all tied back to a single holding entity. Small transactions, mostly, nothing that would have triggered a flag on its own. But taken together, they add up to a consistent flow of funds, all originating from the same source and all feeding into accounts that, until this morning, we had no idea existed." "The supply van," Ridley said, glancing at Barrett. "This is what's paying for it." "This is what's paying for everything," Naomi confirmed. "The guards, the reinforced door, whatever's left of their operation. Cut this off, and there's no money left to maintain any of it." Barrett leaned over the table, studying the account trail with the same intense focus he'd brought to the ledger itself. "How fast can we freeze it?" "Legally, that depends on jurisdiction." Naomi pulled up a second screen, this one filled with legal terminology that meant nothing to Ridley, but clearly meant everything to the room around her. 2 of the 3 shell companies are registered in territories where we have existing relationships with regulators. We can move on those within 48 hours if we file the right documentation. The third is trickier, different jurisdiction, less cooperative government. That one might take longer. "Then we start with the 2 we can move on immediately," Barrett said. "Even a partial freeze cuts their resources in half. That buys us time on the third." Ridley had been quiet through most of the exchange, watching the machinery of Barrett's legitimate world operate with the same precision as the underground one. Different tools, same discipline. But something about the account records nagged at her, a detail she couldn't quite place until Naomi scrolled further down the spreadsheet and a name flashed briefly across the screen before disappearing into the next column. "Wait," Ridley said. Go back. That name. Naomi scrolled up. A registered agent's name sat beside one of the shell company filings. Nothing that meant anything to the analysts in the room, buried in legal paperwork most people would never read closely enough to notice. I know that name, Ridley said slowly. That's the man who ran the utility room checkpoints. Not the one who chased me out, a different one, older. He used to come through every few days to check who was sleeping where. People who stayed in that subway network for any length of time learned to recognize him. He wasn't dangerous, exactly, just thorough, like he was keeping track of something. Barrett went still. You're saying this man has direct contact with people living in that tunnel system? I'm saying he's the reason people either got left alone down there or got moved along. I always assumed it was some informal territory thing, squatters keeping other squatters in line. I never thought. She looked at the screen again, at the name sitting so plainly among legal filings that should have had nothing to do with a man checking on people sleeping in an abandoned subway room. I never thought he was connected to something like this. Naomi was already typing, pulling additional records tied to the name Ridley had identified. If he's been managing informal oversight of that tunnel network, on top of serving as a registered agent for shell accounts, he's not just administrative, he's operational, possibly the one coordinating movement between the terminal and wherever else they're keeping resources hidden. Barrett looked at Ridley with an expression that had shifted somewhere between admiration and disbelief. You just identified an operational lead that 8 years of surveillance missed, sitting in a spreadsheet none of us would have thought to connect to a man checking on the homeless. I lived down there, Ridley said simply. You notice things when your safety depends on knowing who controls a space and who doesn't. The room fell into a different kind of focus after that, Naomi's team redirecting resources to trace every filing connected to the newly identified name, cross-referencing it against property records, old surveillance photos, anything that might reveal how deep his involvement actually ran. Barrett stood at the head of the table, watching it all unfold, but his attention kept returning to Ridley, sitting quietly at the edge of a conversation she'd cracked open without anyone else in the room realizing how significant her contribution truly was. By the time they left the tower that evening, the freeze orders were already filed on both cooperative jurisdictions, the third under active pursuit, and a new name added to a growing list of people Barrett's team would be watching closely in the days ahead. What had started as a subway shortcut for shelter had become, in a space of little more than a week, the single most productive intelligence effort his organization had run in over a decade. You realize, Barrett said as they walked out into the evening air, that you've officially become more valuable to this family than most people who've worked for me for years. Ridley huffed out a short, disbelieving laugh. I still don't have anywhere permanent to sleep. Barrett glanced at her sideways, something unreadable in his expression. We'll see about that. The freeze orders had barely gone through before Naomi called with a warning Barrett had been half expecting. They know, she told him over the phone, her voice clipped and urgent. 2 of the accounts triggered internal alerts within their own network before we even finished the paperwork. Whoever's watching those funds move knows exactly who's behind it. Barrett didn't wait to find out what that meant in practice. Within the hour, he and Ridley were back in the armored sedan, the manor left behind, for a location even fewer people knew existed. A small cottage on the coast, 3 hours north, tucked behind a windbreak of pines, where the nearest neighbor was a lighthouse keeper who valued his own privacy too much to ask questions about anyone else's. The cottage was smaller than anywhere Ridley had stayed with him so far, weathered wood and salt-worn shutters, nothing like the marble and glass of his other properties. Somehow, that made it easier to breathe in. Desperate people do desperate things, Barrett said, setting a laptop on the small kitchen table and pulling up a live feed from the estate's security system, still active even from this distance. If the Kestrel Crew is as thin on resources as we think, cutting off their funding might push them towards something reckless. I'd rather we not be an easy target while that plays out. They fell into a rhythm over the next 2 days that felt different from the manor, quieter, slower, stripped of the constant motion of security teams and financial analysts. Ridley found herself watching the ocean from the cottage's back porch more than she watched the security feeds, and more than once she caught Barrett doing the same thing beside her, his usual sharp focus softened by the sound of waves against the rocks below. It was on the second night, the fire in the small hearth burned down to embers, that Barrett finally spoke about the thing Ridley had wondered about since the first morning in his penthouse. Why a man who owned half the city still carried himself like someone permanently bracing for another loss. "My father built everything I have," he said, staring into the coals rather than at her. The alliance the Kestrel Crew betrayed, that wasn't just business to him. Those were men he trusted like family, some of them since before I was born. When they turned, it wasn't just warehouses and roots we lost. My father stopped trusting almost everyone after that, myself included, for a long time. He died 5 years later, still convinced the betrayal would eventually finish what it started. Did it? Not the way he expected. Heart attack, not an assassin's bullet. But by the time it happened, whatever family feeling had existed in that house was already gone. I inherited an organization and a mansion and about a dozen people who called me family out of obligation, not because they meant it. He glanced at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she hadn't seen from him before. "I've spent 11 years running something enormous and going home every night to an empty penthouse. I didn't realize how empty until a stranger climbed onto my fire escape and I found myself glad of the company before I even knew her name." Ridley sat with that for a moment, the fire popping softly in the silence between them. "I never had much of a home to lose," she said eventually. "My mother left when I was young. My uncle raised me for a while, the one who taught me the delivery codes, but he passed when I was 22, and after that there wasn't really anyone left. I bounced between jobs, then between apartments I couldn't quite afford, then eventually I stopped affording apartments altogether." She pulled her knees up to her chest, staring at the same dying embers he'd been watching. "I used to think losing my family meant losing the only thing that would have made me matter to anyone. Turns out you can survive that. It just makes you careful about who you let matter to you afterward. And now? Now I'm sitting in a cottage with a man whose family history is directly responsible for the danger I'm currently in, and somehow that still feels safer than most rooms I've been in for the last 2 years. She gave a small, tired laugh. "Says something about the last 2 years, probably." Barrett studied her in the low firelight, the exhaustion that had softened into something steadier over the past week, the wariness that hadn't disappeared but had loosened its grip considerably, the quiet strength she'd shown at every turn since a storm had thrown her onto his fire escape. "It says something about you," he said. "You've been handed nothing but bad hands for years, and you're still sharp enough to crack open a decade-old mystery my entire legal team missed." "I told you, I just recognized a pattern." "You keep saying that like it makes it smaller than it is." He held her gaze, something quiet and deliberate in the way he said it. "I've had a lot of people in my life who wanted something from me. Money, protection, a piece of what my name could get them. You've never once asked me for anything, Ridley. You just kept showing up and making yourself useful because that's who you are, not because you were angling for something." She didn't have an answer for that. Not one she trusted her voice to deliver without cracking, so she said nothing at all, and Barrett didn't push her to. They sat together in the dying firelight instead. Two people who had each spent years learning not to expect much from anyone, slowly discovering they'd found something neither of them had been looking for. Not danger, not opportunity, but the unfamiliar, fragile comfort of no longer being entirely alone. They returned to the city 3 days later, once Naomi confirmed the final jurisdiction had processed the third freeze order. All accounts tied to the Kestrel Crew's remaining operation were locked, their funding cut down to nothing overnight. Barrett gathered his core team in the financial district office to finalize what he called the last piece, identifying exactly who they were dealing with before deciding how to close this out for good. "We have a name now," Naomi said, pulling up a file on the man Ridley had recognized from the tunnel checkpoints. "Desmond Ray, registered agent on all 3 shell companies, and according to property records, the man who's held informal control over that stretch of subway tunnels for the better part of 6 years. Barrett studied the photograph attached to the file. An older man, grey at the temples, unremarkable in every way except for the eyes, sharp and watchful even in a grainy surveillance still. Run everything you have on him, family, prior addresses, any connection to the original Kestrel Crew roster from 11 years ago. It took less than an hour for the answer to come back, and when it did, the room went quiet in a way Barrett hadn't expected. "He's not on the original roster," Naomi said slowly, reading from her screen. "He was never a member. Desmond Ray was a mid-level accountant for the alliance your father ran before the Kestrel Crew broke off and betrayed it. Company records show he was terminated the same month the betrayal happened, officially for embezzlement. Unofficially," she hesitated, "the file notes say your father suspected him of feeding information to the Kestrel Crew before they turned, but there was never enough evidence to prove it." Barrett felt something cold settle in his chest. "You're telling me the man who's been managing their remaining funds for over a decade is someone my father fired and half suspected of helping start this whole thing?" "It looks that way." Ridley, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, frowned at the photograph on the screen. "That doesn't match what I remember. Desmond didn't act like someone running an operation. He acted like someone watching one from a distance, making sure it stayed contained rather than expanding it. He never brought anyone new into that tunnel system. If anything, he kept it smaller than it could have been." Barrett looked at her sharply. "What do you mean, contained?" "I mean, whenever someone new tried to move into that stretch of tunnels, people who looked like trouble, not just folks needing shelter, he'd run them off within a day or two. I always assumed it was territorial, but if he was managing money for a crew trying to rebuild, why would he actively keep them small?" The room fell into a different kind of silence, the pieces shifting into a shape none of them had expected. Naomi pulled up the financial records again, and this time, instead of looking for what the money funded, she traced where it had stopped growing. "She's right," Naomi said, after several minutes, disbelief creeping into her voice. "These accounts peaked almost 4 years ago and have been shrinking steadily ever since. Whoever's managing them hasn't been trying to rebuild the Kestrel Crew. They've been quietly running it into the ground, diverting funds into dead ends, delaying supply orders, keeping the operation just barely alive instead of letting it grow back into anything dangerous." Barrett sat back, the full shape of it settling into place slowly. He wasn't protecting them. He was strangling them from the inside, for 4 years. "Why would he do that?" Ridley asked, "if he helped them betray your family in the first place?" Barrett didn't have an answer, not yet, but he had a way to get one. Within the day, his people located Desmond Ray, not hiding in some fortified location, but living quietly above a hardware shop, 3 blocks from the very subway station where Ridley had once slept. He didn't resist when Barrett's men found him. He'd been half expecting them, he said, for years. The conversation that followed, held quietly in Barrett's office rather than anywhere that risked violence, revealed a story neither Barrett nor Ridley had anticipated. Desmond hadn't fed information to the Kestrel Crew before the betrayal. He'd been forced into the accounting role after they'd already turned, threatened into silence with his daughter's safety on the line. For years, he'd done the bare minimum to keep them from hurting anyone else, quietly siphoning resources away, delaying their plans, keeping their reach small enough that they could never rebuild into the threat they'd once been. He'd never had the leverage to bring them down entirely without exposing his daughter to retaliation. Barrett's freeze orders had finally done what Desmond alone never could. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Desmond told Barrett plainly. "I'm telling you the truth because your father deserved better than what happened to him, and I couldn't give it to him while I was still protecting my own family from these people. If you want to hand me over to the authorities for what I did, I understand." Barrett studied him for a long moment, thinking of 11 years of silence, of a father who died still believing the betrayal would never be answered, of a woman who'd fallen out of a storm and cracked open a mystery that had outlasted a decade of professional investigators. "You kept them weak for 4 years at your own risk," he said finally. "That's more than most people would have managed." With Desmond's cooperation and the last of their funding gone, what remained of the Kestrel Crew collapsed within the week. The few men still loyal to it scattering once their resources disappeared entirely, the terminal building quietly reclaimed by the city with no confrontation required at all. No shots fired, no retaliation at Barrett's door. Just 11 years of unfinished business, closed out not through force, but through patience, sharp eyes, and a woman who'd noticed what everyone else had missed. 2 weeks after Desmond Ray's confession closed the last chapter on the Kestrel Crew, Barrett brought Ridley back to his main estate. Not the coastal cottage, not the countryside manor they'd used as a temporary shelter, but the grand family property he hadn't set foot in properly since before his father died. He'd avoided it for years, he admitted to her on the drive there, because it held too many rooms full of memories he'd rather not walk past alone. He didn't feel that way anymore. The estate looked different in daylight than it had in any of the tense, hurried visits during the past few weeks. Gardens that had gone slightly wild under years of minimal upkeep, a grand staircase that still held faint scuff marks from a boy who used to slide down the banister when his father wasn't watching. Barrett walked Ridley through it slowly, room by room, telling her small stories he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone in years, where his mother used to keep fresh flowers before she passed, which study his father retreated to after the betrayal, the exact window where a young Barrett used to watch the driveway for cars that carried news he didn't want to hear. "Why are you showing me all this?" Ridley asked, standing in the doorway of a sunlit sitting room that clearly hadn't been used in a long time. "Because I want you to understand what I'm about to ask you," Barrett said, "and I want you to know it isn't a small thing to me." He led her to inside were property deeds, portfolio summaries, a formal offer letter with her name typed at the top in neat, official print. "Head Administrator," she read aloud, disbelief coloring her voice, "of your family's real estate portfolio. You cracked a case my legal team couldn't solve in 8 years. You spotted a pattern in a spreadsheet that redirected an entire investigation. You read guard rotations from a rooftop like it was second nature, and noticed a name buried in shell company filings that turned out to be the key to ending this whole thing without a single person getting hurt." Barrett leaned against the edge of the desk, watching her carefully. "I don't hand out positions like this because I feel sorry for someone. I'm offering it to you because you've already proven, more than once, that you're better at this than people I've paid for years." Ridley stared down at the offer letter, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper the way they used to trace the brass tag on the duffel bag that had started all of this. "I don't have any formal experience, no degree in property management, no background in anything like this." "You have instincts most people spend their whole careers trying to develop. That's worth more to me than a piece of paper." He paused, something more careful entering his voice. "And I'm not only offering you a job, Ridley. I'm offering you a home, a real one, not a temporary shelter while the danger passes, not a guest room you feel obligated to earn your place in. This estate has been half empty for years. I'd like it to stop being empty." She looked up at him then, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, the weight of everything that had happened over the past few weeks settling quietly between them. The storm, the fire escape, the duffel bag that had carried far more than either of them realized, the countryside manor and the lookout tower and the small cottage where they'd finally started telling each other the truth about who they really were underneath everything else. "A month ago I was sleeping in a subway utility room," Ridley said quietly. "I didn't have anywhere to go, anyone who'd notice if I disappeared. And now you're standing here offering me a home and a career like it's the easiest decision in the world. Is it not?" "It's not that simple for me. I've had things taken away before, people who said stay and meant it right up until they didn't." She met his eyes, some of the old wariness surfacing again, though softer now than it had been on that first night. "I need to know this is real, not gratitude, not something that changes once the danger's gone and you don't need my help solving mysteries anymore." Barrett crossed the small distance between them, closing the folder gently and setting it aside, like it suddenly mattered less than what he wanted to say. "The danger's already gone, Ridley. The Kestrel Crew is finished. Desmond's daughter is safe, the funding's frozen, the terminal's been handed back to the city. I don't need you to solve anything else for me. I'm asking you to stay because this house feels less empty with you in it, and I'd like to find out what that feels like when it isn't attached to an investigation at all." Something in her expression finally cracked open. Not the careful composure she'd carried through every dangerous night of the past month, but something softer, more uncertain, more hopeful than she'd allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll stay." Barrett's answering smile was small, but it reached all the way to his eyes, the first time she'd seen it look completely unguarded, without the weight of 11 years of unfinished business pressing behind it. Outside, the estate's gardens had begun to stir in the afternoon light, wild and slightly overgrown, but full of quiet promise, much like the two of them standing together in a study that had once held nothing but old grief and unanswered questions. A homeless girl had knocked on a Mafia boss's door in the middle of a storm, looking only for shelter from the rain. What she found instead, buried beneath danger and old betrayals and a decade of silence finally broken, was the very thing life had taken from both of them years before. A family, rebuilt from nothing, standing steady in a house finally ready to be lived in again.